Музыкальный журнал «Диссонанс» находится в стенах Московской консерватории, где сейчас проходит 10-й Европейский конгресс по музыкальному анализу, что является огромным событием в жизни музыкальной теории всего мира. И мы решили поговорить с организаторами конгресса и гостями.
Это очень крупное событие международного масштаба. Приехали гости со всей Европы, приехали гости из Америки.
I'm very glad to be here, and I feel honored to be at this famous institution.
The conference is very important for me to take part in this conference because the level is so high.
I really love that we could come here physically, even in this situation with this pandemic. I love the city. The schedule is really full, but that's normal for a conference of this amplitude. So
in on-site conferences you can really meet the people, and this is what makes connections. What is the heart of a conference? To make connections to people, to meet them in person.
Usually the conference has hundreds of attendees. I went to the previous one in Strasbourg in 2017. At least maybe 200 people came. So in this case, only maybe 15 people or less arrived in person, which changed the dynamic significantly.
What about was your report?
My communication is about Beethoven sketches and exercises, written in the first period of the life of Beethoven, and with different purposes, like take note of ideas or to set up exercises in order to understand how to play better. If they were written in the period in which Beethoven was pianist and composer, and so he needs to practice and to upgrade his ability.
Mon répertoire est très vaste et très large. En fait, j'ai une approche hypnopsychologie de la musique de tradition orale en Méditerranée. Bon, il s'agit d'une approche pluridisciplinaire entre anthropologie de l'oralité, travail de terrain, ethnomusicologie et expérimentation de l'écoute musicale. L'objectif de mon intervention dans le cadre de ROMAC 10, c'est de jeter les bases d'une nouvelle approche pour esquisser un modèle d'écoute culturalisé.
My report was about an analysis of Bevern, Anton von Bevern, Opus 28, and I think it was very interesting here. It's not only about analysis, it's also about teleology and philosophy and analysis together in this dodecaphonic music is very good. I think, yes.
About teleology approach to Webern's music?
To tool to analyze Webern.
Like Aristotelian teleology or what?
Teleology, a mix between neuroscience approach, mix also with Aristotle approach, of course, and some little things from the representational theories of psychologists and theories of the mind.
My paper is on Bruckner and his harmony, the way that he writes the ends of his symphonies, the codas, to close them properly. What we find by looking at the Bruckner codas with linear harmonic analysis is that there's a lot of plagal motion from 4 to 1, and that it is not easy to see unless you see how the keys that are being transited in the piece relate to one another. This is often missed by methods of analysis like Neo-Riemannian theory or Schenkerian analysis, because they focus on voice leading, counterpoint, and the relation of one chord to the next one without seeing the relation of the keys. In fact, even keys are a bit poorly defined in some of these methods of analysis, because a half cadence does not imply a key, according to Schenker. Whereas in Wagner and also in Bruckner, sometimes you can define a key with a half cadence. So using this method of analysis, the paper shows that in the codas you achieve big macrostructural plagal cadences in between groups of keys that are only visible if you look at the ways keys interact with each other and groupings of keys interact with each other. The insight of this paper, maybe the relevance of it for other studies, is that, tonal music is probably a lot deeper than just the surface. Of course, there's a great wealth of opportunities and things that you can do with the tonal idiom. That's why it has great longevity for hundreds of years. But Bruckner being at the end of this period, at the end of the 19th century, and the people who came after him, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, etc., saying that tonal music was obsolete or exhausted of its possibilities, maybe with my paper and the claims that it puts forth, maybe it challenges that a little bit. In fact, it wasn't obsolete. It hadn't been exploited fully. There was a lot more to do, just on different levels.
Can you tell us something about the connection between tempo and our feelings about performance?
Of course, so my presentation which was right now, about how performers' implicit knowledge or implicit skills regarding the structure of the performance influences their performance choices, which are in turn reflected in listeners' ratings, in listeners' responses to these performances. And I shared results from a preliminary experiment and a case study, basically measurements. The results from the preliminary experiment showed that moment-to-moment predictability of the musical material, as rated by listeners, is in an expressive performance tightly linked to the tempo. So basically, the more predictable the musical material is, the quicker performers tend to play, especially before the Second World War, when performers did not have so many outer constraints on performance, such as they did not have the urgent feeling, or the urgent need. They didn't feel the urgent need to beat the beat, really. So they could be free in tempo. So, and in turn, performers from before the Second World War period tended to slow down at more unpredictable, that is, more informative places, which were, in terms of information content, higher. So they were more informative. I contrasted two performances of Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata for violin and piano, two very famous performances, which were rated by listeners as very differently, actually. So one of the performances, and actually 1 out of the 4 performers, were rated as very much more expressive and engaging. I took a short excerpt from the sonata, which contains a piano solo, a longer piano solo, actually the beginning of the development of the first movement of the Kreutzer Sonata, and I measured the beat onsets of the two performances. This yielded quite intriguing results because, first of all, just before the principal component analysis, still, you could see from the results that the most engaging performer was on a short time scale, more unpredictable. However, on a longer time scale, he was able, and this is what the principal component analysis could reveal, he was able to kind of anticipate longer phrases. Unlike the other one, the less engaging and the less expressive performer. So expressivity and engagingness seems indeed to be connected to the long-range cognitive planning of a performance on one hand, and on the other hand, on the short-term unpredictability of the performance.
You have made a great presentation about Romanian composer Ștefan Niculescu and about guitarophony in his music. As I understand, guitarophony is something between polyphonic and melody or monody texture.
Yes. Mainly I was talking about heterophony, and especially in his theory. And to be more exact, heterophony is like a superimposed structure. In his theory, he's talking in his theory separately about heterophony, and after that, 4 years later, he wrote another article when he integrated heterophony among the 4 other, let's say, compositional techniques, monody, polyphony, homophony, and heterophony, as one of the basic syntactical categories. So this was the main idea. These 2 ideas were the main subjects of my paper yesterday, my presentation. And so heterophony really basically is like a superimposed simultaneous variation. So you have a basic melodic line, its variants, and everything superimposed. So, but that's just a basic definition.
Can you recommend 1 or 2 or 3 some pieces of music of Romanian composers that should be listened by our audience?
Yes, sure. I recommend most of Niculescu's works. For example, I exemplified aphorisms by Heraclit. I also exemplified Ison 1 and 2. Even if you're looking for some heterophonic aspects, you can look for some of Enescu's works, for example, his Chamber Symphony. Also there you can find some close to heterophonic aspects, and also there are lots of other composers. Many Romanian composers are and were interested in these phenomena. So Cornel Țăranu, maybe even Aurel Stroie, Vasile Herman. So are many of them.
I was talking about schemas in jazz standards. It is a very, let's call it, hands-on analysis, or an analysis that serves people who want to learn the language. I'm teaching, I'm interested, I'm in that. In that sense, I would consider myself rather old-fashioned in the sense that I think study the old masters, or not even masters, study the grammar, learn to build small sentences, learn the craft before you set out to make art. And that is also the philosophy that we represent in Amsterdam. And
Вообще, в традициях Евромака установка на то, что 4 европейских языка, английский, немецкий, французский, итальянский, совершенно равноправны, и никогда ни на одном конгрессе не было никаких переводов. Кто понимал, тот понимал. Теперь добавился еще русский язык по понятным причинам, и мы решили для себя, что уж русские тексты мы постараемся перевести на английский, чтобы просто они не остались только вот для наших русскоязычных. И мы это делаем.
Важная такая история, начало нашего общения с иностранными коллегами, профессиональное, именно теоретическое, потому что если в других отраслях музыки и музыковедения было нормальное общение довольно уже долго, да, оно строится, и очень много общих тем. В теории мы соприкасаемся очень мало друг с другом, тут есть очень такие серьезные расхождения, они терминологические, они понятийные, они ментальные, наверное, даже в чем-то. Вот. И западная теория достаточно специфична, она, в общем, переживает такой период новый, можно сказать, да, там, с 70-х, 80-х годов, это полностью обновленная теория.
Узнаем у гостей Конгресса, что они думают об отличиях европейской музыкальной науки от российской.
In Russian music theory, the focus has been very strongly on the craftsmanship in the whole time. Try to open up, I would say to you, to what happens in the rest of the world, in that case the Western, but please stick also to your own tradition.
I don't know so much about Russian music theory and musicology. Even the papers here, I did not manage to really attend so many. There were problems with the translation and also the cross-scheduling of sessions. With European and American musicology are a bit different because in the US you had a split between the American Musicological Society and the Society for Music Theory. So often those two subjects are a little bit divorced from each other, whereas in Europe not so much. Russia I cannot really speak for.
Qu'est-ce qu'une musique en fait? La question qui se pose, qu'est-ce qu'une musique? Pour un musicien Aka de l'Afrique centrale, si on lui fait écouter peut-être une musique actuelle, ce qu'on appelle les musiques actuelles en Europe ou ailleurs, ou bien une musique contemporaine, peut-être pour lui c'est des sons, c'est pas de la musique. Et si on inverse la situation, si je fais écouter un compositeur contemporain peut-être qui n'est pas sensible aux musiques de tradition orale ou aux musiques africaines ou indiennes, etc., parce qu'il n'a pas les codes, les clés d'écoute, n'a pas la culture, n'a pas la sensibilité. Et la musique, c'est ça, c'est l'univers du sens. Il y a des sons, des organisations, tout le monde peut entendre ça. Il y a les règles générales de la Gestalt, tout le monde peut entendre les sons, mais la musique, ce n'est pas seulement cette organisation du son, mais tous ces renvois et ces facteurs externes à la musique, c'est-à-dire les renvois vers le culturel, le social, le cognitif, le spirituel, etc., etc. Donc il y a des interactions fortes entre le social qui influent sur la manière d'entendre, de jouer et de percevoir la musique, et de l'autre côté, comment la musique, elle ouvre ce réseau infini d'interprétation de la musique. Pour moi, la musique, c'est beaucoup plus que des sons. C'est un sens très large qui implique les dimensions esthétiques, sociales, cognitives et sémantiques, etc.
Russian musicology is tremendously interesting, first of all. I have seen in one of these rooms here of the conservatory the pictures of such great theorists as, for example, Kholopov. In Europe, we don't know almost anything about them. His approach, Kholopov's approach, appears to me so close to what Lerdahl and Jakandov decades later, 1 or 2 decades later, did in the US, and which was then taken over in Europe as well. And the language barrier, I think that's a huge problem for Russian musicology, because without that language barrier, Russian musicology would be much more prominent overall in the world. In music psychology, for example, I read a book by one of the most prominent Russian music psychologists. She was probably a professor here at the conservatory or at the university or at another conservatory here in Moscow, and it's translated into English by Oxford and published by Oxford University Press. It's about musical talent. And the style of this book is so different from the Anglo-Saxon and from the European way of treating the topic. It's the style of the presentation of the topics. It's much more literature-like, actually. This is what I would say. It's much more lyrical, even. I would say much more philosophical and less a bit even, I would say, less down to earth.
Как писал Людвиг Витгенштейн, о чем невозможно говорить, о том следует молчать. Считают ли наши гости, что музыка относится именно к таким феноменам, о которых следует только молчать?
But I think that if we play music only, we are not able to give the right suggestion to the listener. We must speak about music, but in a very friendly way. It's very difficult to speak about music using very complicated terms. We must speak in a different way in order to let people to understand and to be in comfort listening music.
Well, I will echo what I heard from the Swedish conductor Herbert Blomstedt, and I recommend everybody to read an interview that he did with Bruce Duffy. It's available online. The interviewer asks him what's the ultimate purpose of music, and he says something to the effect of, well, human beings coming in contact with something greater than themselves in some form or another perhaps makes them a better person. And the specifics are a bit difficult to elucidate because music is very diverse. There is music that is traditionally considered as beautiful, and then maybe more abrasive works which have their own beauty. But his point remains, and I agree with it, that music is a big creative force and something that's larger than the individual and maybe larger than the human project. So putting yourself in touch with it and understanding it and engaging with it as much as a listener, as much as a researcher, has some positive effect, maybe not a very concrete or specifically definable one, but some kind of positive effect.
Je précise d'abord que tous les chercheurs musicologues, indépendamment de leur sensibilité, de leur approche et de leur discipline mère, tout le monde fait de l'analyse musicale, mais selon des approches complètement différentes. Soit on étudie des traces à partir d'un enregistrement audio à l'aide des sonogrammes, des spectrogrammes, etc. Et on peut parler des configurations qu'on peut déceler à partir de ces traces, soit à partir des récurrences, des structurations sur la partition. Mais toujours les questions qui se posent, c'est de savoir d'un côté comment le compositeur il a conçu son œuvre, c'est-à-dire l'étude des processus poétiques pour comprendre l'esthétique du compositeur, son école, son mode de pensée, etc. Et de l'autre côté, l'auditeur. L'auditeur, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire ? Ça veut dire comment cette musique sera entendue par un auditeur, quel type d'auditeur, quel groupe d'auditeurs, acculturés, pas acculturés, experts, pas experts. En fait, en psychologie, si je reviens un peu à mon terrain d'investigation, moi, parfois, dans mes recherches, je m'inspire des travaux des psychologues et je pose la question souvent à mes auditeurs après l'écoute d'une pièce, qu'avez-vous entendu de la pièce ? Et ensuite, je pose la question, comment avez-vous entendu la pièce ? Cela suppose que j'implique deux processus complémentaires dans l'écoute. De la partition du son vers le sujet, c'est-à-dire qu'est-ce qu'il y a dans la musique qui permet à l'auditeur de structurer sa perception, un son fort, un timbre particulier, une accélération rythmique, etc. Et de l'autre côté, comment avez-vous entendu la pièce ? C'est quels sont les schémas cognitifs prescrits dans la culture, dans la perception de l'auditeur, qui lui permettent de structurer la musique ainsi. Donc on a toujours un aller-retour entre traitement de signal à un niveau neutre, si l'on veut, mais à partir de ça, on peut dégager des théories, des configurations qui sont là, mais est-ce que ces configurations sont pertinentes du point de vue de l'écoute ou non? Ça reste une question souvent et toujours d'actualité, parce que certains chercheurs effectivement s'intéressent à ces questions, d'autres un peu moins. N'oublions pas aussi que parler des structures, et c'est ce que j'ai essayé de montrer à travers ma présentation dans le cadre de ce congrès, il faut définir qu'est-ce qu'une structure, quelles sont les structures perçues ou non, comment les percevoir, et qu'avons-nous appris sur les approches qui mettent souvent trop l'accent sur les structures en évacuant la grande dimension qui est la dimension psychologique et sémantique, c'est-à-dire l'acculturation et les connaissances culturelles qui seront impliquées dans la perception et l'organisation de la structure. Donc votre question est pertinente, mais qui nécessite vraiment une conférence pour répondre, parce qu'elle aborde à la fois les processus de création, les processus de l'œuvre sous forme de traces, que ce soit traces configuration ou traces mémorielles, si on parle des traditions, des cultures musicales de tradition orale, et de l'autre côté, la perception de l'auditeur qui dépend de plusieurs paramètres, de son acculturation, de sa concentration, de ses compétences, de sa concentration, etc., etc.
As a musician, I would say that you don't need to speak about music. The music speaks for itself. So a good music must be able to speak for itself. However, musicologists have a tremendously important role in analyzing music and to help performers in making performances more interesting, more knowledgeable, more conscious sometimes. Actually, musicology and music psychology, music analysis and music psychology, the main topics of this conference, can be the most important helpers of performers in many, many ways. So not only in performing more expressively, but also in practicing more expressively to find ways to make informed choices of performance.